Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is one of the most dramatic geopolitical shocks of our time. A moment that nobody believed would arrive so quickly, a moment that defied predictions, intelligence assessments, and even the expectations of Ukraine's closest allies. This is the story of how Crimea was reclaimed, how a peninsula once thought permanently lost returned under Ukrainian control, and why this moment changed everything. For years, Crimea was the symbol of frozen conflict, a place that represented the limits of diplomacy and the cost of ignoring international norms. After its annexation in 2014, most of the world considered Crimea occupied territory, but quietly accepted that reversing the situation would require an unimaginable shift in global politics and military power. Analysts spoke of it as a near impossibility. The public accepted it as a sad but permanent outcome of geopolitical reality. Even within Ukraine, while the dream of reclaiming Crimea was alive in hearts, the practical roadmap was unclear. Yet history has always favored the unexpected. Empires collapse, states rise, borders shift, and the world is frequently reminded that what seems permanent can disappear in a heartbeat. And so began the most unlikely transformation of the decade, a chain reaction of military breakthroughs, internal collapses, strategic misjudgments, and global diplomatic pressure that restored Crimea to Ukraine. The story did not start with a single battle, but with years of quiet preparation. Ukraine had spent considerable effort rebuilding its armed forces, not only with weapons but with doctrine, training, intelligence sharing, and a new confidence born out of survival. The early phases of the war had taught Ukraine a powerful lesson. Capability alone does not determine outcomes. Resilience, adaptability, and information dominance matter just as much. In the months leading up to the Crimean turning point, satellite imagery, drone surveillance, and cyber intelligence revealed an increasingly overstretched Russian presence. Supply lines were thinning, ammunition shortages were growing, and morale, especially among conscripts and reserve units, was weakening. Russia had attempted to secure Crimea through massive fortifications, but these fortifications were becoming irrelevant as precision. Strike technology evolved. Ukrainian strikes on key supply hubs slowly isolated Russian forces. Every rail depot damaged, every ammunition dump destroyed, every radar station blinded chipped away at the perception that Crimea was impregnable. Meanwhile, something deeper was happening beneath the surface. A growing resistance movement within Crimea. Local populations who had remained silent for years began quietly aiding Ukrainian intelligence. Communication networks once thought impenetrable began to leak. Patterns of troop rotations, vulnerabilities in air defense coverage, and weaknesses in logistical routes were exposed. But even with all these factors in motion, no one could have predicted the monumental turning point that was about to unfold. The catalyst came in the form of a daring Ukrainian breakthrough on the southern front. Ukrainian forces executed a rapid maneuver that bypassed fortified lines, leveraging electronic warfare to disrupt communications and drone systems. Precision artillery, Western, supplied long-range missiles, and domestically produced strike drones worked together in an unprecedented synchronization of firepower. The shock effect was overwhelming. Russian units that expected a slow, grinding offensive were instead hit with a lightning, fast assault that shattered their defensive cohesion. This breakthrough did not merely push Russian forces back. It dislocated the entire southern command structure. For the first time, the land corridor between mainland Russia and Crimea began collapsing. This alone created historical panic in Russian military circles. Crimea depended on two main lifelines: the Kerch Bridge and the land corridor through occupied southern Ukraine. When the land corridor broke, Crimea effectively became an island, again isolated and vulnerable. Desperation followed. The Russian command scrambled reinforcements, but with supply routes cut and Ukrainian strikes intensifying, the reinforcements never arrived in meaningful numbers. Ammunition that once flowed freely now trickled. Food and medical supplies diminished. Morale plummeted. Ukraine had not yet entered Crimea, but Crimea was already shaking. Meanwhile, diplomatic pressure grew worldwide. Nations that once hesitated to confront the issue of Crimea now openly questioned Russia's control. Statements from European capitals, Washington, and international bodies condemned Russia's failing position. The world's narrative shifted. Instead of if Ukraine can take Crimea, the question became when. Inside Russia, frustration boiled. Public confidence faltered. The government responded by tightening censorship, punishing dissent, and projecting false images of control. But the truth was impossible to hide. Drone footage, intercepted communications, and testimonies from soldiers revealed a collapsing grip on the peninsula. When Ukrainian forces finally reached the approaches to Crimea, the world held its breath. It was an unprecedented moment. No military analyst expected Ukraine to reach this point so soon. Russian troops retreated to defensive positions within Crimea, but their supply problems persisted. Ukraine, operating under overwhelming intelligence, support, and total air defense disruption capabilities, began shaping operations across the peninsula. Explosions, targeted fuel depots, radar systems, command centers, and anti-aircraft sites. Ukrainian special forces, long believed to be operating secretly within Crimea, coordinated sabotage missions. Bridges inside the peninsula were disabled, communications were jammed, panic spread among occupying authorities. The true turning point came when Ukrainian drones bypassed Russian air defenses using new-generation stealth technology. These drones struck military airbases deep inside Crimea, destroying aircraft that Russia desperately needed to maintain air superiority. With air power weakened, Russian ground units found themselves increasingly exposed. The Kremlin's options dwindled. Reinforcement was impossible, resupply was impossible, evacuation was chaotic, and staying to fight a determined Ukrainian assault was increasingly suicidal. When Ukrainian ground forces finally crossed into Crimea, they moved with precision, discipline, and strategic restraint. There were no reckless advances, no unnecessary risks. Every movement was calculated. Every sector was cleared systematically. Propaganda networks collapsed. Russian installed authorities fled. Ukrainian flags reappeared across towns and cities that had long lived under occupation. But the world was not prepared for what happened next. Russian forces, in large numbers, surrendered. Units abandoned positions they had once sworn to defend. Exhausted soldiers, lacking supplies, leadership, and hope, simply gave up. Some attempted evacuation through unofficial routes. Others blended into civilian populations. Others retreated in disorganized clusters. The myth of an unbreakable Russian presence in Crimea shattered in real time. Within days, Ukrainian forces reached Sevastopol, the crown jewel of the peninsula. Once the pride of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Sevastopol now witnessed one of the fastest dissolutions of military control in modern history. The Black Sea Fleet, already weakened by years of drone attacks and missile strikes, evacuated portions of its remaining ships. Several vessels were scuttled or abandoned. The once mighty fleet that symbolized Russian dominance was reduced to a shadow of its former power. Ukraine raised its flag over strategic locations one by one. The images spread across the world: crowed squares, emotional reunions, Crimeans crying as they waved blue, and yellow flags they had hidden for years. These were moments that transcended politics. They were deeply human, deeply emotional, deeply historic. Global reactions were swift. Some nations celebrated the victory as a triumph of international law. Others feared the consequences of Russia's humiliation. Markets fluctuated, alliances recalibrated, and world leaders scrambled to adjust to the new geopolitical reality. For Russia, the loss of Crimea became the most significant strategic defeat since the end of the Cold War. For Ukraine, it became a symbol of resilience, unity, and the belief that no matter how dark the situation, liberation is always possible. People around the world debated what this moment meant for global security, for Europe's future, for Russia's internal stability, and for the principle of territorial integrity. Old alliances strengthened, new ones emerged, and diplomatic channels buzzed with negotiations to prevent escalation. But beyond geopolitics, there was something more powerful at play. The reclamation of Crimea was not merely a military victory. It was a victory of identity, a victory of a nation that refused to accept defeat, a victory of people who believed that justice may be delayed but cannot be denied. It was a reminder that international borders matter, that aggression cannot be rewarded, and that the courage of a nation can change the course of history. In the aftermath, Ukraine began reintegration efforts. Roads were rebuilt, administrative systems restored, schools reopened, communication networks repaired, and public services revived. Crimean communities that had suffered under occupation finally experienced freedom again. Crimean Tatars, who endured persecution and suppression, celebrated openly. Families separated for years were reunited. Businesses reopened, cultural events returned, the peninsula began to heal. But the global consequences continued to unfold. Analysts called it a strategic earthquake. Military scholars studied the campaign as an example of 21st century warfare, how drones, cyber operations, intelligence integration, and morale can reshape the battlefield. Politicians debated whether this victory would inspire other regions, or whether it would create expectations for similar conflicts worldwide. Some nations feared that Russia's defeat could provoke reckless retaliation. Others believed it would force Russia into long, overdue reforms. Some argued it would shift the balance of power in Europe permanently. Others predicted new diplomatic frameworks to prevent future conflicts. One thing was clear: the reclamation of Crimea was a moment that changed everything. It reshaped alliances, military doctrines, energy strategies, and future security planning. It redefined Ukraine's role in Europe. It signaled the decline of Russia's projection of invincibility. And it showed the world that determined nations, when backed by unity and strategy, can achieve what once seemed impossible. As global leaders responded, media channels everywhere debated implications. Supporters of Ukraine celebrated. Critics discussed risks. Economists analyzed the impact on energy markets, trade routes, and global stability. Security councils worldwide updated their threat assessments. It was not just a regional chain. It was a global shockwave. For Ukraine, the victory served as the emotional climax of a long struggle for sovereignty. Memorials were created to honor those who sacrificed their lives. New national holidays were proposed. The sense of unity across the country deepened. This was not just reclaimed land. It was reclaimed dignity. And for the world watching, the message was unmistakable. Even in an era of powerful states and advanced militaries, even in a time when nuclear deterrence shapes decision making, the human desire for freedom and justice can override everything. The story of Crimea's reclamation became a case study in resilience, strategy, and historical inevitability. Historians would later describe it as one of the most significant events of the century, a moment when the course of international politics took a dramatic turn, a moment when alliances strengthened and the global order recalibrated, a moment when hope triumphed over fear. And as Ukraine raised its flag across Crimea, the world watched, a world shocked, amazed, and forever changed. Thank you for watching. If you want more deep geopolitical breakdowns and global events analysis, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, stay informed, stay aware, and see you in the next video.